Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where not only do I chat with a tech leader about how technology is transforming our life, work, industry, and even world, but also ask a guest to share their origin story and how they got involved with technology, and maybe, just maybe, find out a little bit more about the soundtrack to their life too. And today we have Mansour Karam from Juniper Networks on the podcast, who has a great story to share. And he's also going to discuss where automation maximizes productivity in the data center in areas such as scaling capacity with output so that the data center development is not inhibited, and also processing repetitive tasks so that developers have more time and bandwidth for crucial development. And finally, I'd like to discuss with him how automation is essential to minimizing expensive mistakes while also providing more robust data sets for IT leaders to apply hyper-accurate insights in development and empower those data-driven decisions that we keep hearing about in meeting rooms. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where we'll talk about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you. Excited to be here. I'm Mansour Karam. I'm the ex-CEO and founder of Apstra, and I'm currently VP Products at Juniper. I've lived in the Bay Area since I came to the US back in 1995, and I've always been in networking.
Love that. And a question I always like to ask every guest, especially people that are successful in the area of technology, is ask that, do you share your origin story and where your love of technology came from, and ultimately how your path led to Juniper Networks? Can you remember what put you on this path?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Beirut, and I was there, except for a few months in France, at kind of the depth of the civil war in Beirut. I had spent just a few months in France, but otherwise, until 1995, which is when I came to the US for my graduate studies at Stanford in 95. That's where I grew up. Well, growing up, I was always, I'd say, strongest in sciences, especially math, in which I excelled, and also in physics. And although as my father actually wanted me to go into medicine, it was very clear that engineering was the path for me. I remember, maybe I was 9 or so. I got my first car magazine, and I became a car geek. And I remember knowing everything about every car. I was just fascinated about that. And like others who are interested in engineering, I was one of those kids that used to enjoy breaking up the toys, break them apart to figure out or tools to figure out how they worked. Anything from remote control cars to old radios. And then in university, I got interested in both networking and robotics. In fact, maybe robotics was my favorite topic at the time. I was always fascinated with closed loop systems, which is why actually, if I were to map it out to today, I enjoy software, that improves quality of experience and simplified operations through, these same closed loop techniques and closed loop validation, which, we'll probably talk about a bit more later in the podcast. But then, in the 1990s, and especially during my tenure at Stanford, networking was exploding, and it was, clearly the field to be in. And so I decided to pursue a specialization in computer networks. In fact, my PhD was around how to handle, audio and video traffic in networks at the time. It was all about quality of experience. And then I got squarely into the data center space when I joined Arista super early. Back in 2005 is when I accepted my offer. The company only had a handful of people. And there it became clear to me through my tenure there that there was still a significant operational challenge that we needed to address for network operators. And so after almost 6 years there, I joined Big Switch, which was an SDN pioneer back in 2011. And what I found quickly is that OpenFlow and SDN, which were the approaches that were being used at the time, weren't the right ones, in fact, for a mainstream operational solution for networks. And that rather we needed a solution at the management plane that is part of an open architecture, open APIs. And so I left Big Switch to start Apstra along with other industry veterans. This included Sasha Retkovich, but also, I'd say, industry visionary David Sheraton, who headed up the distributed systems laboratory at Stanford. I knew him from there. He was also the founder of Arista, so I worked with him closely at Arista. He also founded a company called Granite, which was acquired by Cisco, and along the way invested in companies such as Google and VMware. And so fast forward a few years, Juniper acquired Apstra earlier this year to bolster their software portfolio and deliver the best experience to network operators. And so here we are.
What a great story. And from there, of course, you now have over a decade of experience in network automation and network solutions, and you currently work at Juniper as the VP of Products. But can I ask that you tell me more about how you're now helping clients deliver on their networking solutions and make the most of their business with Juniper? Because it's incredible the work you're doing here, but I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, when you talk to network operators, they're facing significant pain points. And the networking is becoming more and more critical to everyone's work, and networks are only getting larger and more complex, and yet the networking teams are not growing. And so essentially we hear similar pain points from all network operators we talk to. One is how can I manage this complexity? And so usually it translates in, they have to make kind of trade-off sometimes, how quickly they want to get things done. And, there are requirements there by the, from the business in terms of like delivering real quickly. But then if they go too fast, then they risk making mistakes that could cause significant problems like outages or security breaches. And so the challenge there, and so how to navigate that, how can you deliver things quickly, yet, avoid, making catastrophic mistakes? That's one. And two, I'd say the other pain point we hear is that, networks, as they become larger and more sophisticated, they generally have components from various vendors. Yet, a lot of times, vendors give you kind of monolithic solutions where, all of the components are from there. And so, what operators would rather have is, solutions that work with all of these different vendors, right? So, open solutions or solutions that are vendor agnostic and multi-vendor. And so how can we deliver that to them? And I'd say maybe, another problem that we've heard customers face is that as their networks scale, these challenges become that much bigger, right? Essentially, the number of links between components, grow quadratically. The number of, the configurations of these networks grow quadratically. And so everything becomes harder to operate. And so how can we help them operate at scale? And I'd say these are essentially our focus as in Apstra at Juniper. Essentially, we are helping simplify the, how operators, operate their networks. We give them a simple, consistent operational model. Through software, we allow them to go fast, but to do it reliably, so they don't, don't cause mistakes, or they don't make mistakes. Two, we allow them to manage these networks in a way that allows for them to have multiple different vendors or components from different vendors in there, and we allow them to do this at scale. So as their networks grow, they, with the same team size, they still have the ability to manage those ever-growing networks.
Now, I invited you on the podcast today to learn more about automation in business. So can I ask that you expand on how automation can actually maximize productivity in the data center, especially around topics such as scaling capacity with output, so the data center development is not inhibited? Because that's a big problem right now, isn't it?
Well, exactly, right. So operations teams are oftentimes short-staffed, right, and especially as the networks grow, they have a lot more to manage, and so they get consumed by the day-to-day tasks of managing their networks, and that involves tons of manual labor, right, unless you have the right tools. And it becomes a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. If they have the time to explore new technologies and plan for upgrades, then they could leverage these new capabilities, which would then relieve them from the manual tasks that they're assigned. They could, in fact, implement solutions like Apstra that will allow them to get in order of magnitude better and do an order of magnitude more with the resources that they have. But in order to achieve that, they need to have the time to spend on making this, making this research, doing this research, and that's time that they don't have. And so, to me, the way I see it is that there needs to be a mandate from the top that says, well, these network operations teams have to spend, a portion of their time looking at new technologies so that they can bring these technologies in, which would, sell them get out of this chicken and egg situation. Through automation, they'll, by deploying the right technologies, they'll have the time, they'll have the ability to scale and do it in a way whereby the data center development is no longer inhibited.
And of course, the big selling point of all this is automation can help processing of repetitive tasks, so developers have more time and bandwidth for crucial development. But is that something you can expand on, and the kind of thing that you're seeing with your work?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way network operators have traditionally managed their networks, they use what we call a CLI, command line interface, which is, in arcane commands, the command line that allows, that they use to configure specific devices. And so think of, if you have maybe 5 devices in your network, that's fine, right? And in the past, that used to be the method, the preferred method. But now that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of networking devices in your network, and they're interconnected in ways, topologies that are more and more complex, then you can see how that just simply doesn't scale. And so what you need is software that essentially automates the whole aspect of running networks, right? So essentially, the network operators should have the ability to say, I'd like my network to do this and that, right? Like I'd like my network to connect these servers in this way. I'd like my network to implement these security policies, and I have all of these constraints in terms of compliance. And then ideally, what you want is for the software to go and configure all of those devices itself. And then not only configure those devices, but then, collect telemetry so that we close the loop, and then the software verifies that indeed the network is delivering on the operator's intent, right? And so that's the type of software that would, relieve the network engineer from, the burden of having to, manage their devices, the networks device by device. And, this is how they can save tons of time and scale the operations of their network.
And I also believe that automation can be essential in minimizing costly mistakes and eliminating human error from mundane tasks in this hyperconnected data center world that we all live in. Is there anything you can expand on that around too?
Yeah, absolutely. When you manage networks manually, you go in and you insert some commands, by typing on a keyboard. It's easy to make mistakes, and when you make mistakes, they could be, devastating, right? We oftentimes hear about these massive outages, and usually they're caused by, some device that was misconfigured, right? Yeah. But the problem is a bit broader than that, right? If you think of how networks are designed and operated traditionally, you have like 2 teams. You have the architecture team, which is from the ground up kind of creating a design for your network that meets, the requirements of the business. And so that's what, they kind of put together this network, and, we call it a greenfield network. It's a shiny new network. But then, traditionally what they did was kind of then toss it to the operators. And then from that point on, the operators manage these networks using a separate set of tools. And usually, these are, that aren't as sophisticated in terms of the tools that are implemented. And, oftentimes over the years, network engineers need to make changes, right? Because, obviously business requirements change. They have to grow the network. Maybe they have to add some new security policies. And, many times they go into these devices manually and they make those changes. And so what you get is this deviation between, what was originally designed by the architect and ultimately what you end up with, if you, in a few years, this deviation is such that it's no longer clear, what's really implemented in the network, right? What are these configurations there for? If you also imagine that network operators, come and go, and so you have attrition there, right? So you no longer have a single source of truth that tells you what your network is doing, and that can be quite dangerous because by adding a configuration, you no longer have a good sense of what it's going to do. Could it create an outage? Could it, open up a security hole, right? And, whether it's a security breaches or outages could be devastating to the business. So, the way we look at it is with the right software, the right software would enable both architects and operators to have a consistent operating model around one single source of truth, right, that captures, the intent. And by doing it this way, the whole system is self-documented. And therefore, you no longer have that deviation, over time between what you want your network to do and what it actually is doing in reality.
And I think I've seen so much change over the last 18 months. And if we were to go back 18 months ago, I would say that the A word was often treated with a bit of caution and people were a little bit intimidated by it. But I think so much has changed now. And I think more and more businesses are understanding the value of automation and freeing up staff from those mundane and repetitive tasks so they can focus on value-add business activities. But I'm curious, from your point of view, someone working in the heart of all this, what excites you about how automation will continue to improve businesses?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, right, over the last 18 months, we've seen a lot of change. We no longer hear, operators tell us, well, it used to be with Apstra that the competition was, well, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to keep the model the way it was. We no longer hear that. Everyone understands, the need to automate. And partly, the pandemic played a role because clearly these businesses had to digitally transform faster than ever, right? We always knew that digital transformation is going to, require a fundamentally different approach to networking. Gartner has said that organizations that fail to adjust network funding and operational practices will be 3 times more likely to fail in their digital business transformation. And so, this is something that is now clear to everyone. And if you don't transform digitally, and if you don't have that network foundation that allows you to do that, you lose your competitive edge as a business. And the cost of organizations losing their competitive edge is prohibitive. I've seen some data which is fascinating. Maybe let me ask you this question: Do you know how many companies that were Fortune 500 companies in 1954 still exist today?
I did look this up. I featured this in an article recently. It's not many at all, is it? I know is it something like 25 or something crazy like that?
Close to 10%.
Wow.
But forget about 1954. Let's look at 2000. How many companies that were Fortune 500 companies in 2000 exist in 2014? Right. And there the number is close to 50%, right? Wow. So yeah. And not only that, let's look at the life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company. It used to be 75 years in 1954, and in 2000 it went down to 15 years, and it's still decreasing, and that's because the technological cycle is accelerating at an ever faster rate. And so, and what differentiates companies that do well to companies that ultimately fail is really how competitive they can remain, and technology is at the core of that. And so, to me, going back to your question as to what excites me, well, it's really about the impact we can make. Networking is at the foundation of every business today, and that's what we do. We're in networking, and we're solving the most complex challenges in networking around operating these networks at scale.
And what about you? What's your big focus at Juniper right now? And what kind of role do you see Juniper playing in that new future of work that we're seeing emerging?
Yeah, so I run the Apstra business at Juniper. So we're very focused on data center network operations. Well, Juniper's role is very clear. Their core competency is networking, right? And with that, they deliver best of breed networking solutions across the board, not only for the data center, but also for the enterprise campus and for cloud providers. And all of these boundaries are kind of blurring. What customers are looking for is networking solutions across the board. And as I mentioned, networking is foundational to the new future of work, the type of work that we're now all gotten accustomed to, especially with the pandemics. And networks are getting ever larger and more complex. And the only way to manage these networks is using the right software that can help you automate the task of managing these networks at scale. And so, that's specifically our focus at Juniper, but also that is what Juniper is focusing on as a whole. They talk about experience first and networking. That's the idea of delivering the right type of experience, the operational simplicity to the network operators, and the best quality of experience for the users and the applications that are utilizing those networks.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today. You've had a fantastic journey in tech. Like as you said at the very beginning, began in Beirut. You're now in the Bay Area working with Juniper. And a question I always like to ask all my guests is if there was a particular song or piece of music that has accompanied them throughout their career, inspired them, helps them get in the zone before going in a big meeting or delivering a keynote. Is there a particular song that has accompanied you on your journey that we can add to our playlist?
Well, I don't know if there is, any one song. I'd say I listen and appreciate all sorts of music, classical, pop, even rap. But I'd say, my favorite has always been classical music, and in fact, I always have classical music in my ears when I'm working. If I'm preparing for a conference or for some event. And maybe even like I can give you some more color here. I love mostly concertos and solo pieces. In fact, maybe I'd say I'm fascinated with concertos. Recently, I've subscribed to maybe a year or two ago to YouTube Music. I don't know if you've subscribed to that, but I thought it's amazing because you now can watch concertos, not just listen to them. And what I find fascinating when you watch them is kind of like this complicity that you see between the conductor and the lead soloists, right? And awesome interpretations happen when the conductor and the soloist are in perfect harmony. If I were to map this to my experience in high tech, I would say, the analogy is how a business leader would interact with the technology leader, like maybe the CEO and the CTO, and when the two are in harmony is when you really get great products. Of course, in concertos and in classical music, there is also this aspect of teamwork. It's clear that an interpretation is only as good as the weakest link, right? So every player has to deliver their part, otherwise it's not going to work. If I can give you some of my favorites here, if you'd like.
Sure, absolutely.
Well, I'd say the Beethoven's triple concerto is just one of my favorites. There's Max Bruch's first violin concerto, Beethoven's only violin concerto, Mendelssohn's concerto. These are some of my favorites. Piano, Chopin's first concerto is just gorgeous. In terms of solos, maybe I don't know if you know Chanson de l'Adieu from it's an etude from Chopin, which is great. I mean, there is many more, and just recently I've gotten into cello concertos as well. So we can talk for an hour just about classical music.
And that is the reason that I asked the question. And I love the story behind your choices there and how it relates to your career in tech. It's so powerful. So I'll be adding some of those to the playlist so other people can listen and enjoy too. And I cannot thank you enough for bringing a touch of class to the playlist too. But before I do let you go, can I ask that you remind everyone listening where they can find more information about what you're doing at Juniper and connect with you or your team online? Where's the best place to start?
Sure. Yeah. So of course, LinkedIn is a great place to start. I'm there, but also on Twitter. My handle is at Mansour Karam. There is at Apstra Inc. for Apstra related stuff, and then for Juniper as a whole is at Apstra. It's at Juniper Networks, and then there are the websites www.apstra.com and www.juniper.net. And we do have a YouTube channel as well, youtube.com/Apstra, where you can watch tons of videos, going deeper into Apstra technology.
Fantastic. Well, I've loved chatting with you today. So many big takeaways, especially how automation is essential to minimizing expensive mistakes and providing robust data sets for IT leaders so they can apply hyper-accurate insights in development. Incredibly cool what you're doing there. But more than anything, just thank you for sitting down with me today and sharing your story and the great work you're doing. Thanks again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Wow, what a great story and a great guy. And I cannot thank him enough for coming on here today and talking about how automation is essential to minimizing costly mistakes and eliminating human error from mundane tasks, especially in a hyper-connected data center, which is something that we seem to be talking about more and more on this podcast. And also, of course, for elaborating on the areas where automation maximizes productivity in the data center. And it is fascinating how attitudes have changed towards automation in just 15 to 18 months. But over to you. If you've got any experience, insights, questions about anything that we talked about today, please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You get me on my website, techblogwriter.co.uk, and LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. I'm just at Neil C. Hughes. Nice and easy to find. So a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.